Hello, everyone, and welcome to the channel. I'm Pastor Siri. I'm a Lutheran pastor and a spiritual seeker, and today we're going to talk about healthy sexuality. Get some popcorn because I have a lot to say. Take a listen. So the first thing I want to say is that we have an issue as humanity with our lack of healthy sexuality. And this is obvious because the symptoms of it are universal. Symptoms of rape culture, symptoms of controlling women's bodies. You can just see through child pornography and through child rape and incest and all of this insidious, awful stuff that causes massive trauma is a universal thing. And just bringing it up causes people to react and have a lot of feelings. We have massive, massive issues with this around the world. And a lot of it is supported and might even stem from some of our religious understandings. And so I really want to bring up some concepts and a little bit of historical background. Could write an entire book on this. So this is going to be a general overview. But my goal is to really help you maybe question some of the messages you might have internalized within yourself that have caused you pain, that have caused you shame, fear, and guilt in regards to your own sexuality, in regards to your own body, and how that's affected your relationship with the rest of the world. That is the biggest thing, is that I believe healing is where we need to go. And I believe that anything that causes pain, fear, shame, guilt, and trauma isn't the truth, and it's not good. And we need to address it, and we need to talk about it in order to heal it. So let's rewind the clock back quite a ways. Now, we can probably see that misogyny is at the root of a lot of sexual issues that have been going on for thousands and thousands of years. In marriage and in family systems, when your son was the one who was going to inherit the farm and get all the inheritance, you had to be sure that that was your son. And without genetic testing, the best way you could do that would be to control women and their bodies and make it illegal and worthy of being stoned to death for women to commit adultery. Men never needed to control their bodies in the same way. They controlled women's bodies. So this is sort of the general idea that has gone on in many different cultures for a long, long period of time. But then fast forward to the early church. Now, what's interesting is for the first 300 years of Christianity, there was a great diversity of thought and the way that people were living. And yes, whether you knew it or not, women had a lot of power in the early church. In fact, educated women were flooding to Christianity in the first 300 years because it was this unique place where they could be heard and listened to and understood and lead. It was, in fact, some people made fun of Christianity for being this like woman-led empowerment thing. Ha ha ha, how crazy, how weird. And remember that Jesus was incredibly empowering to the women that he interacted with. He treated them on a unique intellectual and spiritual level that nobody else did. And so that was the precedent of the Christian church. One of the things that is really interesting is that there was this concept that Jesus was coming back very soon. And so people like Paul were sort of like, don't even worry about getting married, focus on your faith, focus on your service, focus on Jesus because he's coming back very soon. And that comes from a sort of Jewish understanding. And yet when that didn't happen, people began to just go on and live normal lives. But people, of course, we still hear to this day this reference that Paul says of like, it's best to not get married. And all of a sudden we made not getting married this incredibly virtuous thing. But there's something else I want to plug in here first. Because in about the 300s, 400s, as the Christian church was growing significantly, there were some people, especially those who lived in cities, both men and women, who were noticing the excessive life of the city. And they found it incongruous with the Christian faith. And so many of them fled to the desert. And in the desert, they fasted, they prayed all the time, they gave up possessions. It was the beginning of the monastic order. And they also were celibate. Both men and women had this, and it was this really powerful way for them to try to reclaim what was real and true in a time that seemed kind of crazy. Pendulum swings kind of happen that way. Now, through all of this, you have this idea of celibacy as being the ability to focus solely on Jesus, on God, on your spirituality. And at its best, that's a choice. You choose to go in and to do that. But at its worst, it's forced upon you, like with the priesthood, and that begins to contribute to a certain mentality about what tempts you away from your celibacy. So when celibacy is forced upon you, it means that your sexual urges suddenly become not a gift from God, like, oh, I'm hungry, I'm gonna eat something, I get to enjoy food, food is really fun, oh, I want a hug, I get a hug, hugs feel really good. Instead of it being a normal part of the human experience that you get to enjoy, because celibacy is forced on you, you start to see those behaviors as really negative. Now, going back to the monastic order, there were women who wanted to be celibate and like lifted that up and even said, yeah, hey, Mary was a perpetual virgin. Therefore, I'm not going to get married and I'm not going to, be a pawn in this game of patriarchy and misogyny. So some of the early feminists, as I will call them, probably became nuns so that they could be celibate and run away from this patriarchal world. So that's kind of fun and interesting, and I don't want to deny that living a celibate life for some people was a freedom and a respite from the world. But imposed celibacy and that perspective that I don't want to be tempted, sex must be bad, that women are bad, means you're repressing your urges. And anytime you say something that is normal and human and universal, and you say it's automatically bad, it gets pushed into your shadow, and all of a sudden it doesn't go away, but that shadow grows until you're able to acknowledge it. So if sexuality is something to control in a smaller and smaller and smaller way in your consciousness, it's almost like it gets bigger and bigger and bigger behind you, and then it has to come out. And so it's going to come out in really, really bad ways. So the more rigid and confined it is in your conscious understanding, the more wild it gets in your shadow. This is why in some of the most repressive sexual cultures of religion and so on and so forth, you have the worst examples of sexuality, of unhealthy sexuality going on. Incest, child pornography, rape, pedophilia. These are coming from a deep woundedness and a constriction of what is normal and healthy and human that is being denied until the shadow reaches out and grabs what it can want. It's interesting to note that in places that are really big on purity culture, meaning you got to keep yourself pure for marriage and you have to dress modestly and, women have to really control the way they look and their bodies so that, they don't tempt men. Statistically speaking, these cultures can have some of the worst underbelly things going on. There is higher rape, higher STDs, higher unwanted pregnancies, and higher prostitution and higher pornography in areas where purity culture and abstinence is lifted up as the highest ideal. You also have a greater example of women who have no idea what to do with their bodies. They don't even know that they're allowed to feel pleasure, because pleasure and sexuality has been seen as such a negative thing. So I want to address another thing that's incredibly harmful as well. And that's in purity culture and these ideas that men are some sort of uncontrollable beast. Like their sexual urges are just there, and they're going to just grab what they want to, and that all of a sudden all the responsibility is up to women to dress right, to look right, to behave right, everything like that, in order for her to be the gatekeeper of sexuality. And her pleasure, her consent, her anything, her humanity is never considered in this conversation. So men are not responsible for what they do in this perspective, because they can't control their crazy sexual urges. Therefore, anything that happens between a man and a woman is always the woman's fault, because she's supposed to be the gatekeeper. And she's not supposed to have pleasure. In fact, if a woman likes sex or wants sex, she's seen as a whore, which is awful. So this perspective, which is not only taught, but is subconsciously transmitted in so many movies and music, and just the way we talk about people in our culture, slut-shaming women and studifying men, is very, very destructive, because it's not true. It doesn't pan out. Men are perfectly able to control their bodies, 100%. Men around this world can get practically naked with their wife, girlfriend, fiance, and be able to stop what's happening, check in with their partner, and stop what's going on. Happens all the time. They are perfectly able to do that. And women have this amazing ability to experience sexual pleasure. In fact, God granted women with this wonderful ability to have multiple orgasms. That feels to me like God's green light for women to have just as much pleasure in sex as men. So this unhealthy sexuality that we've been taught, that somehow women's bodies need to be controlled, and that men are sort of uncontrollable and tempted all the time, and therefore all the blame is on the woman. This is deeply, deeply, deeply unhealthy. And women are often so trained to feel so much shame and guilt about their bodies and sexuality that they don't know what they like, and they don't know how to advocate for themselves. They don't even know what all their parts do, let alone do the guys know what all those parts do. Furthermore, I just want to state that in places where women are the most restrictive in terms of what they can wear and so on and so forth, there's actually more rape. And so this completely shatters the illusion that it's women's fault, and if women would just dress up more modestly, then bad things wouldn't happen. Nope, it's not true. It's not about what women do or don't wear. If you want to lower cases of rape and prostitution or pornography or pedophilia or any of those things, the first thing we have to do is start talking about sex. We have to start talking about it, and we have to let each person be responsible for their own body. And we have to start talking about consent. If we want to lower rape in this world, we need to tell men they are 100% responsible for their own actions and their own bodies. And they need to be trained to ask for consent. It needs to be universally condemned that to take pleasure at the hands of someone else who can't or is unable to say no, that is deeply more morally wrong and traumatizing and should be universally condemned. Healthy sexuality is when we get to a point where we are able to take responsibility for our own bodies and to come together with somebody else in a consensual relationship where both people have a mutual agreement of what's going to happen, and both people are allowed to experience the pleasure of what's going on. And I'm not going to get into whether you should or shouldn't be married. That should be your choice. That should be 100% your choice. Healthy sexuality means if you want to wait till you're married because that makes you feel better, go for it. Healthy sexuality also might mean that you don't want to have that restriction placed on you that's going to somehow make you feel guilty if you break it. We can set these perfectionist ideals that we think are great and that people should be able to attain to. But the more rigid these examples of perfection are with our body, with sexuality, with all of it, with spirituality, with religion, all it does is, as I said, it makes what's in our conscious control feel tighter and tighter and tighter. And then in the shadow, we get this huge, big shadow that's going to come out in the craziest way. And that's not healthy. We need to bring everything out in front into the conscious, and we need to be given permission to look at it. And we need to be able to talk about it in places where they talk about exactly what happens with sex, where they talk about body parts, where they talk about STDs, where they talk about, how a woman gets pregnant and all of this. When they talk about all of these issues, teen pregnancy actually goes down. STDs go down. People do not, according to what some people think, the evidence does not show that just because you talk about sex and condoms means that everyone's going to run out and have sex. It's not true if that's your worry. It doesn't actually work that way. Even if you grew up in a relatively progressive home, and even if you never had anything really bad happen to you, most of us still have sucked in this sort of like cultural understanding that women are not allowed to feel pleasure and should somehow be hiding their body and should somehow, at the same time that we're objects for men's use and abuse. And so if we don't look pretty, maybe we don't want to go out. If we don't feel pretty, that somehow being pretty is the rent we pay to exist in the world. All of these messages are deeply harmful, and so let's examine them all. Let's realize that these messages and these things come from really, really old trajectories that go back hundreds, if not thousands of years. And while the message has shaped and transformed over time, it's still very much present. And when we can notice it, how it manifests within ourselves, when we can start seeing in music and in movies and in TV shows how these unhealthy values are being promoted and seen as normal, we can start to bring all of that junk that was subconsciously planted in us into the forefront, and we can begin to decide what to let go of. We can begin to decide what we don't want to be a part of. And that is deeply empowering. So I hope this was helpful for you. As I said, this is a huge subject, and we could go so deep on this, but I want to empower you to be able to think a little bit more about these issues. So if this was helpful, I invite you to like or subscribe, comment and tell me what was helpful about this video, or if there's another video you want me to do in the future. And we'll see you next time.